Good evening and welcome. Thank you for coming out this evening. It's a great turnout for our bus network event. The event this evening is organised by the Transport Planning Society and very kindly supported by Engineers Ireland, also promoted by IPI, CIHT and CILT. My name is Elaine Brick. I'm Chair of the Transport Planning Society in Ireland at the moment and Transport Planner at ACOM. Most of you, there's lots of familiar faces here. A lot of you have been to our events already. We launched this time last year actually, and since then we've had about 8 or 9 events, most of which, all of which, shall I say, have generated lots of interest and lots of debate. The Society itself, we are the regional branch of the main Transport Planning Society in the UK, which has about 1,500 members. We have a steadily growing membership in Ireland now as well. And I suppose the launch of the Society really came about in recognition of the need for more bespoke and structured professional development for transport planners. And of course, there's a massive growing interest in transport planning as well, both as a topic and as a career choice. And so TPS sets out to support that. On your way in, you might have picked up this strategy, Bus Connects. Most of you will have seen something about it in the media last week. There was an official launch of the Bus Connects NTA's strategy. Now, the Bus Connects itself is one key element of the wider GDA transport strategy. And tonight we're here to talk about one element of the overall Bus Connect strategy. And that is reimagining the Dublin bus networks. I guess we're really here to talk about the redesign of the Dublin bus network, and it's something that is drawing a lot of interest across transport planning and the wider sphere. The event coincides with the launch of the first output of the study, which is the Choices Report. And the Choices Report sets out a baseline picture of where we're at the moment and some very high level options as to where we might be able to go in the future. That's online now, and the NTA is welcoming submissions on it. So the event then this evening is quite timely in that we have the lead consultant working on the project, Jarrett Walker, here with us to talk us through what they're going to be doing over the next few months and what we can expect and our opportunities to engage with the process. The turnout here this evening indicates how interested people are in this. We have a bus network that has evolved over many decades and hasn't seen a review of this type for some time now. We're very dependent on the Dublin bus network. It responds to about 55% of all public transport trips crossing the cordon in 2016 and about 27% of all trips in general. So we're heavily dependent on it, and on top of that dependency at present, we want to further grow public transport patronage. So we're very interested to see how this study and recommendations are going to get us to that point. Jarrett Walker, who's going to take us through the presentation, has been a consulting transit planner since 1991, helping to design transit networks and policies for a large range of communities across the world, in places like across North America, Europe, Australia and New Zealand. I'll let you take it from there, Jarrett. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's I really, really appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to talk with you. The interest of the transport professional community is a very important part of what makes these projects succeed or fail. And we are at a very early stage right now where there are plenty of ways this can still turn out, and your own views on it and the conversations you have within the community will have an impact on what that outcome is. Just briefly, a little more about me. I have been doing this for about 25 years. I also wrote a book called Human Transit, which is a very friendly, non-technical, probably not technical enough for some of you, very, very non-technical book aimed at a general reader that talks the general reader through what's the geometric problem of public transport, what is the nature of the problem, what do we have to think about, and in particular, how do the facts about how public transport works influence the determine the choices we need to think about our priorities. So if you want to go deeper into that, that's there. So again, as Elaine said, we're at the first step in redesigning a bus network. Just to give you a little picture of the explanation she just gave about where we sit, there's the transport strategy for the Greater Dublin region, which is a 20-year long-term strategy. It has various modal elements, one of which is bus. The bus element is implemented by the Bus Connects program, which is looking out more in a kind of 5-year range. It has several parallel elements, 3 of which are particularly important here. There's the bus network redesign, which we're here to talk about tonight. There's also a concurrent fare policy project, which is about fare changes and cashless ticketing. A key thing about that project is that the aim is to eliminate fare penalties associated with interchange, so that the cost of your trip does not vary based on how you get there. It's based only on where you're going. That turns out to be very important. And then faster and more reliable service. So there's a third track that's really about improving the speed and reliability of the system overall. So inside the bus network design, then there are 2 major elements. We're at the stage of the choices report. Later on, there will be a recommended network. I use the term choices report for what is more commonly called an existing conditions report, because the point of this report is to help people see their choices. So we're not just talking through the data, we're actually talking about how the data, being as it is, presents the community with certain choices or trade-offs, and encouraging people to think about those particular choices. So I want to start taking this back to something that everybody can care about. We've gotten into the habit of thinking about public transport, first and foremost, as being about the wall around your life. We are all, to varying degrees, in prison. And the walls of our prison are the limits of where we could get to in a reasonable amount of time. Outside of those walls are jobs you can't hold, schools you can't go to, clubs and organizations you can't belong to, and friends you will never meet in person. So the potential for all kinds of aspects of our lives depends fundamentally on where we can get to in a reasonable amount of time. And of course, one of the most fundamental reasons that people move to cities at all is because there will be lots of people nearby, and therefore lots of opportunities of all kinds nearby. And if you don't have access to those opportunities, you might as well live in a village. So this is a diagram called an isochron. Engineers already know about it, but they're rarely shown to the public, and we're in the business of showing them to the public as often as we can. So here's a hypothetical person named Jane. This happens to be from a study of ours in Silicon Valley, California. And she's plopped down at a particular place, and those blobs show where she could be in 15, 30, 45, or 60 minutes on public transport plus walking. So that's her freedom. That's what she can do. Obviously, you can draw similar kinds of drawings for where you could get to on a bicycle, where you could get to by car, and so on. But this is what she can do on public transport. And fundamentally, if we focus on expanding people's freedom, on moving those walls outward, making these blobs bigger, that turns out, in general, to also be a pretty effective way of increasing patronage, by making the service literally more useful to more people for more kinds of trips, to go more places, to move people's walls outward, so that they are more likely to be able to choose to rely on public transport. So, so the cool thing is that this isn't just a way of increasing patronage; it's also that freedom is a cool thing in itself, right? It's a thing we can get people interested on its own merits. Many people are concerned, for example, about access to jobs, access to opportunity, and so on. And that's exactly what this is a picture of. Now here's the interesting thing. Freedom is geometric, by which I mean The analysis that takes us from a network design to what the shape of people's blobs of opportunity are is a purely mathematical calculation. There is no social science in that. There is no human behavior. It's not empirical. And as a result, we can be very, very certain about that. So this is the other cool thing about talking about this freedom outcome separately, is that I am much more sure of that than I am about what will happen in response to that in terms of patronage. It's going to broadly correlate with patronage. Patronage modeling is already to some extent actually looking at this and building upon this kind of impact that public transport has, the expansion of freedom, as the basis for patronage predictions, but then a whole bunch of other things go into patronage predictions about human behavior that are much more complicated and much more difficult to justify, and ultimately you have a different philosophical problem about predictability when we start talking about those things, because human behavior is not necessarily all that predictable. What I'll sometimes say when I'm talking to a group of young people is that the foundation is that when we do longer range patronage predictions, like going out 20 years, we fundamentally have to assume that when you are the same age as your parents are now, you will behave exactly the way they do, because that's what we're doing fundamentally. We look at people's behavior today, which is your parents' behavior, and we assume that that is how you will behave 20 years in the future. We can't not assume that in order to move forward. So while I admire people who do patronage projection, there's a whole lot of philosophical issues about the predictability of human behavior. But what I do know, what I can predict, is not just what freedom will look like, but also I can predict on historic grounds, very far back into, from evidence very far back into history and biology, that human beings will care about that in 15 or 20 or 30 or 100 years. It will still matter, and because it's a thing I can describe geometrically and I know it matters, it's an interesting thing to talk about. And in some contexts, it may actually be more useful than the patronage prediction. So how do we expand that? How do we grow the blobs? How do we get more people access to more places? The basic recipe goes like this. You run a pattern of very high frequency lines, forming a connected network that are reasonably fast and reliable, and that are focused on places that are favorable to public transport success. Let's look at each of those. So frequency comes first. Frequency, literally how often the buses come or when the next bus is coming, is a cubed value in that it does three independent excellent things that make service more useful. First of all, it's reduced waiting. And I'm not just talking about time you spend waiting at a bus stop. I'm talking about all the time you spend not where you want to be because the bus isn't coming when you would ideally like it. The second is easier connections. Where high-frequency lines cross each other, it is easy to get off one and onto the other, and that is the essence of how a pile of routes becomes a network, if we understand a network as meaning elements designed to work together for maximum effect. Third, of course, reduced impact of disruption. If one bus goes out of service, the next one's coming soon. So as a result, what we find is very high payoffs to frequency. That looks like a lot of dots, doesn't it? The y-axis is productivity, which is patronage divided by the cost of providing the service. So, patronage over the cost of serving it. The x-axis is frequency with higher frequencies toward the left. This is all of Dublin's bus routes, and as you can see, the trend line is toward higher productivity with higher frequency. And pause to consider that that's more remarkable than it looks, because if you double a frequency, the first thing you've done is doubled the bottom of the productivity ratio. The first thing you've done is to double the operating cost, which pulls the productivity ratio down. And I'm not saying that necessarily you'll get this outcome in time series if you double a frequency, but we do see that over this network and over every other public transport network I've ever worked on, you see this general relationship that frequency deployed in the right places gives you the strongest payoff in terms of patronage per unit of cost. If I take virtually any public transport system I've ever worked on in 50 years, and in 25 years, and I rank their routes by productivity, the high frequency routes are generally at the top. Because frequency is both so fundamental, so transformative, and at the same time also invisible, we find we need to bang the table about it. The thing about frequency is that if you're a motorist, you don't have an experience of frequency that helps you understand what it is in public transport. I work in North America, where most of the decisions about public transport are made by people who are themselves motorists, who drive cars themselves, who don't use public transport very much. And as a result, we have this problem of how to help them understand why this matters so much. There isn't anything in the motorist's experience like the problem of frequency, which is you cannot begin your trip until something happens. Closest thing that happens in the motorist experience is the cycling of traffic signals, which isn't that long. But so what we have here is a thing that needs particular explaining. Sometimes I will say, if I'm talking to a group of suburban people who I know are almost all motorists, sometimes I will say things like, imagine there is a gate at the end of your driveway that only opens once an hour on the out. And that's the only time you can get your car out. And that starts to get at what frequency is and why frequency is so fundamental. Why frequency is the thing you really have to have before you do anything else, you know. Without frequency, none of it works. Because of that, many public transport agencies are actually consciously marketing just their frequent services, the pattern of services that are always coming soon. In Portland, Oregon, where I live, this map is published, which is just a quick diagram of here's where you can go if you're not somebody who waits very long, right? Turns out to be very helpful, has helped to organize our land use planning, has helped to organize things like our parking policy. We do not need as much, we can build apartments and things without parking if they're located on the high frequency network, so we know people will rely on public transport. So we use this to organize a lot of other things, including our priorities for infrastructure. Washington, D.C., here's an example of a high quality, I think, public transport network map, and the key thing about it is that the frequent network jumps right out of you. It's the red lines. And you can see very clearly which are the lines that are useful all the time. Remember, this means these lines are always coming soon. That means that where red lines cross, it's easy to interchange. So that red network, that network of just frequent services, is very important information about where the network is actually useful. And so the infrequent lines have quite properly receded in that map so that you can look close and see them, but so that they don't distract you from the big picture of what the frequent network is doing. Vancouver, a city I've worked in for many years, developed a regional a frequent transit network, and you'll see that map in color in many stations and other places in the city. They had adopted a policy that over half of all population and jobs will be on the frequent network. They actually achieved that in a few years, and of course it happened not just as a result of the frequent network expanding, but also as a result of people moving to it, development occurring on the frequent network, partly in response to the high quality of service there. The problem, of course, and this is one of the real challenges of public transport politically, this is the challenge, is that we can't make public transport equally useful everywhere. There are places that are just more favorable to it, and if we're pursuing patronage, we're going to have to focus on those places. This gets us to the larger problem, which I'm not going to go too deeply into tonight, but which exists, which is, are we pursuing patronage, or are we pursuing some opposite goal that I like to call coverage? Coverage being all the reasons that we spread the service out so everybody gets a little bit, knowing perfectly well that some places are just not going to be able to generate patronage. So I try as much as possible to make this too a purely geometric point, because generally when we talk about this, there will be people in the audience who hear me insulting their homes, right? Who hear me insulting their communities. And I've got to always say, no, it's just geometry. Look at the geometry. So density is the most important. Those two bus routes have the same cost to operate because they both have two buses on them, but the one on the top is serving twice as many people. There are twice as many people within walking distance of every bus stop. That's what density is, and that means we're competing for a market that's twice as large. Of course patronage is going to be higher. How could it not? If it weren't, you would need a story about why people at that density are less likely to use public transport. And that doesn't make sense. At least it doesn't make sense until you get to extremely high densities, like parts of inner city Dublin where almost everyone is just walking everywhere. In the big picture, it's obvious that you're going to get higher ridership where you have more people. So again, not insulting low-density neighborhoods, but this is just the geometric fact of it. Walkability. If this is a bus stop, then there's a circle around it that is the air distance to the bus stop. And then there's how much of that area can you actually walk to the bus stop from, and that's a function of the connectivity of the local street network and the permeability of the local street network. Obviously, if the street network is creating barriers to people being able to walk to the bus stop, then you're going to have lower ridership, lower patronage, because less of the area is accessible. You've simply removed some of the market area of the stop through those barriers. What this looks like in Dublin, for example, density and walkability, Drumcondra Station area is a great example of a place where everything works. You have public transport on the north-south axis. You have not just extremely high density, but you also have a local street pattern that's very fine-grained in east-west streets coming out to the main street. So it's very easy to walk out to the main street and get to where and get to the station. And so we access a large area from a single stop because of this effect. Somewhere out between Terenure and Rathfarnham in the suburbs, we see the opposite. We see, for example, a district with very, very long blocks that are impermeable. And as a result, that means people are walking longer, more awkward, circuitous paths to get to a bus stop, which means quite simply that fewer people are close to the bus stop by actual walking distance. Some of this is the river, but some of it is just urban design. Some of it is the layout of the network, the decision to have impermeable street patterns. Linearity. My architecture friends understand density and walkability, but linearity is a thing I'm always explaining to them. In public transport, the straighter the line and the shorter the journey, the more people will find it useful. So here are two different diagrams of two different ways that you could have arranged a city that consists of those four places. If they are all in a straight line, then I can run a single line that is useful to all of them to connect any of them to each other. That's the best possible outcome, because that's the shortest possible distance I have to cover to be as useful to all of those trips. If, on the other hand, they are set back, the business park in its cul-de-sac, the giant big box retail 500 meters from the street, the college or hospital up on its little hill tucked back away, the residential area back in its own cul-de-sac area. There are a lot of cul-de-sacs around Dublin once you start to recognize them, right? Last night I was walking down at the Grand Canal and I was starting to explore this new area called Capitol Dock. And I had this initial horror because the entire thing appeared to be a cul-de-sac, right? Access only from the west end. I've been assured that there will be a little bridge that makes that not a cul-de-sac. But you can think immediately of many places around Dublin that resemble this in various ways. So this is really fundamental, and this is also a thing that will be that public transport cannot help but respond to and differ according to this. So for example, Southeast Dublin, very nice, generally pattern of straight lines, reasonably spaced, so that we don't have to twist and turn very much. Compare that to Finglas, and again, if you live in Finglas, I hope you don't think I'm insulting your community. This is just the geometry of it. Finglas is laid out in a way that makes this very difficult because you have a straight line, the Finglas bypass, which is followed by the 140 there, which misses Finglas by and large, but is very straight. And then you have the twists and turns that you have to go through to actually get close to the major development in Finglas, and it's a no-win situation. I can promise you right now that our ultimate network design, whatever it is, will look awkward in Finglas because there's no way not to. There's no way given that street pattern. So the key point here is if you've got a linear layout, we're going to be able to do better service for you, all of the things being equal. Now, what's going on in Dublin? A historically radial network is beginning to reach entirely predictable limits. In your existing system, all frequent routes are radial. Now, by frequent, I mean running all day and coming at least no worse than every 15 minutes all day. That is what they look like. We've mapped just them. By the way, I will always use red to denote high frequency service. And as you can see, every single one of them goes into the CBD. So you do not have a frequent path to do anything else. You do not have a frequent path in particular to do orbital movements like Tallaght to Dundrum or Blanchardstown to Lucan and so on. The network forces you to go into the city. There are a few orbital routes, but they're infrequent. The most frequent of them are about every 20 minutes. Many of them are every 30 minutes or worse. The problem at those frequencies is that it's difficult to interchange to them. It's because the frequency is so low, you may have a long wait to interchange to them, and that makes them less effective. So this is one large issue. The second, it's interesting to look then more closely. I'll geek out a little bit on this since I know you're engineers. It's interesting to look a little more closely at what this actually does to route structures. So we have this pattern, of course, of the major radials, pretty straight, most of them, going out of Dublin in different directions, therefore, as they go out, getting further apart. And finally, we get out to a distance where there's a lot of stuff in between them that's not really close to either of them, right? And when we get out to that point, the network really struggles because there isn't a good street pattern for just drawing straight lines into the city from these places. So the network ends up doing things like this. My colleague Daniel, who is here, coined our term for this, orbital compensation. It means fundamentally that a radial network comes into an area where the orbital street pattern is actually more favorable to public transport than the radial street pattern is. But not having orbitals working with radials, it finds itself having to just twist and turn in very awkward ways to cover those whole areas, right? This is the area between Swords Road and Malahide Road in the northeast. The other kinds of issues we have, which become particularly prominent outside the M50, are cases where the street network is increasingly fighting the bus network and winning, of course, the street network always does, and forcing buses to do truly crazy things. Some of you may be familiar with the pattern in Ongar, with the wildly circuitous things that bus has to do. There's a great example out from going west out of Clondalkin. Look at the 13. It's a complete 3.5 cycles of a sine wave that you will drive through in the course of getting from Dublin out all the way to the end. Now this is interesting because, you know, if you live here, the problem this route is trying to solve is that so much development out here is nonlinear. It's been put back in the large cul-de-sacs, and I mean a whole neighborhood can be a cul-de-sac, right? If you can access it only from one side. So we have this situation where we can draw a very straight line, which is the 151, but it's just missing almost everything. And then if you want to actually serve everything, you end up with something like the 13. And I don't know who has the patience to ride through all this. I guess some people do. We do have some patronage out here. But you can see how when things get this crazy, you know, you can start to imagine how a more interchange-based approach would make everyone's trip shorter, right? The presumption right now, if you live out here, is that what's most important to you is to have a no-change, single-seat ride all the way to the city. Well, if that's what you want, that is what this is, right? But you could imagine that at this point, I mean, if I were riding this bus and going to the city, I would get to there and I would pull out my phone and see if the 151 is coming. Because if I could change to that, I would be in the city much sooner. So there are situations where, there's a nice example of a situation where interchange can quite possibly lead you to a much faster trip if you're willing to change buses. We'll come back to that. Then there's the problem of complexity. It's a part of our job, part of our work, and when we go from city to city to city, is that we drop into a new city and we have to learn our way around very quickly. We have to learn what how the public transport system works. And I have to say, in Dublin, until it took us a long time, because particularly extreme complexity in the city. You think about it, routes are converging from all over every corner of Dublin because the presumption in the past has been that every place in Dublin needs a direct bus to the city. That's a lot of buses coming into the city. And they trip over each other and they make incredibly complicated patterns that you cannot draw a clear map of this. This is the clearest map there is. I'm not sure it could be made any clearer. It's still incredibly complicated. The effect of a map is going to be overwhelming complexity because the reality is just overwhelming complexity. I walk through the city and I think I have the experience that most people do if they don't somehow know the system really well, and I don't know how you would know the whole system well. they have the experience that, boy, there's an enormous number of buses here everywhere, but it's just not at all clear how I would use them to do anything that I don't know how to do and don't do routinely. So here's turns out to be the big question. The biggest question of all of our work, the single question that we're most going to want everyone's opinion about, is can we ask people to change buses more in return for quite a number of benefits? And this is the question we're asking the community. It's a question we're asking all of you. I hope you will express your own views about it. But here's how it works. Here's a simple geometry again. Here's a simple geometric explanation of why interchange can get you where you're going faster. So here's a simple fictional city with 3 residential areas at the top, 3 destination areas at the bottom. And if you were going to draw the first impulse most people would have would be to draw a direct route from every activity center to every destination area, which gives you 9 routes. And there's a sample trip over on the right. Let's say we can afford to run these routes every 15 minutes. Sorry, let's say we can afford to run these routes every 30 minutes. That means you're going to wait an average of 15 minutes for your direct bus to where you're going, whichever that is. 15-minute wait. But we could also do it like this. We could have just 3 routes instead of 9, and one from each residential area to one activity center crossing at an interchange. Now the key thing about this is the magic of frequency. If we have 3 routes instead of 9, then the same budget can be used to run those routes 3 times as often. So now, instead of a bus every 30 minutes, we have a bus every 10 minutes on each of these routes. And because of that, you're going to wait 5 minutes on average at your origin, and then you're going to wait 5 minutes on average at the interchange. That's 10 minutes. That's faster. If you count the waiting time, it's faster than this, right? You actually get there 5 minutes sooner. Now, you can play with the math yourself, but if I used a more complex example, let's say I had 10 residential areas and 10 activity destinations, it starts to look more like the scale of Dublin. Then it's actually a 12-minute advantage, 12 minutes faster on the more interchange-dependent network. That's because you can build up those frequencies greater and greater and greater until you basically walk out and there's a bus right there almost all the time. So, so advantages of interchange in the big picture. Higher service frequency leading to shorter waits. A simpler and easier to remember network. Notice, how hard is it to learn 3 routes as opposed to 9 routes, right? Just simpler. You're going to more easily remember a route of a network of fewer and more frequent services. Often faster travel time, which means greater freedom. To say that you can get there sooner is to say that we moved the walls of your prison outward, that you can get to more places in an amount of time that you have. And finally, this is important, it's a network that's useful for going more places because there are so many places where frequent routes will cross one another, which is the key to being able to make a very easy, fast interchange, and that's the key to you being able to get to lots of places instead of just places on the route that you're on. Now, those are the advantages. There are, however, disadvantages, and I do not want to in any way diminish them. They're an important part of the conversation. If we ask people to interchange, then they're going to experience their journey as being interrupted. You're curled up in your seat, you have your laptop out, you have your book out, whatever, and then you have to pack it all up and get off the bus and walk across the street and get on another bus. There are lots of things we can do to make interchange easier, but we can never remove that fundamental nuisance of it. A short walk and wait may be required. Again, you may have to cross the street, walk to another bus stop. Those are always fairly short walks, but it's not nothing. And there's a little bit of a multiplier effect on reliability problems. Anything that can go wrong twice. If your your second bus could be late and your first bus was on time, you have a slightly higher chance of some sort of disruption affecting you because 2 routes are involved. On the bright side, of course, both of those the buses are coming so frequently that somewhat mitigates that impact. So anyway, these are all reasons to not like it. And I think the first one in particular is the one that everyone starts with. It's just, oh, I have to pack up and get off the bus and go over there and get on the bus. Yeah, it's a nuisance. So now let me come back before we, so that's going to be the big question. But let me show you some specific examples of strategies we might use and what the payoffs might be. So here's the biggest one. The way the Dublin bus network works right now, let's look just at the radial element of the network, into and out of the CBD. You see this basic pattern that there are major corridors heading out in different directions. And each of these corridors has a bunch of bus routes on them overlapping. So a simpler example, one of the simpler ones is coming out of Ballymun. There are two bus routes on top of each other. One of them goes through the city and on toward Blackrock and Marion. The other goes through the city and on toward Harold's Cross. So the pattern tends to be of a kind of barn dance happening in the city, where these folks all march in together and then they all go different places. And these folks all march in together and they go different places. They're all crossing over each other. Now this is useful in some ways and less useful in others. If you're coming from one of these major corridors and you're just going to O'Connell Street, this is going to work well for you, if you're just going to the center. On the other hand, if you're trying to go beyond the center, let's say you're trying to go from Liffey Valley to Rains End, or you're trying to go from Rathgar to Drumcondra, then there's only one route, only one of the routes on your street does that exactly, goes to that other corridor. And so you're going to have to wait for that particular bus as a whole bunch of other buses go past. And that wait will turn out to be fairly long. Many of these routes are running every 15, 20 minutes all day. So you end up waiting a long time to get on the particular bus that you want, that will then take you without interchange all the way to where you want to go. There's another way we could arrange this, and that would be that all of the buses coming in from each corridor would go to the same corridor on the other side. So for example, all of the buses from, let's say, Liffey Valley would go through to Rings End. All of the buses coming in from Malahide Road would go out southwest toward Crumlin. All of the buses from Blanchardstown would go on down Stillorgan Road toward all the way out past UCD. So you'd have these continuous spines. And in this case, of course, the local routes would merge into those spines. There's no interchange out here. It's just a merging or a branching, and come and form those very high frequency spines. And then that high frequency spine would remain together all the way across the center city and out the other side. The effect of that is that now you have a very simple, very high frequency, like look up the street and the bus is coming frequency, to go not just to the city, but across the city and well out into the other side of the city. Now, that's cool in itself, but the real payoff is that in that structure on the right, you have all of these extremely frequent spines intersecting in the city in a very legible way. And so you could change from one of them to the other to go out any other spine. And again, the change is easy because the frequency is extremely high, right? And so notice how the network on the right gives you a set of simple, legible services. You can remember them the way you would remember a Lewis line, right? It's not too hard to keep those sorts of things in your head because they're simple and they're frequent. You know, what Lewis means to us is, I can remember where the route is, and if I go to it, it's always coming, right? And well, we can do that with buses too. And that's essentially what that right-hand network is. So you can see how suddenly the inner city in particular, the network becomes so much simpler, because now you're looking at distinct corridors that you can remember. You can draw a very clear city center map of how those intersect, and so on. So, so this is one of the main concepts we want people's views on, because it is more interchanging, but it's also, as you can see, much faster access to a lot of places. Another example is what we might do to create frequent orbitals. So this is a typical example, and I don't want you to think this is particularly the inner south of Dublin, because you can actually rotate this diagram as you like to make it about any side of Dublin, because it's really an abstract diagram about a geometric principle. So the way the existing network tends to work is that we've got big frequent radial services going out in these different directions. And then we have these awkward little services doing orbital compensation, right? They're going partway out and then they're turning off and they're starting to wander to get back into those nooks and crannies. And often they're turning onto streets that are really more designed for orbital service. So But everybody has a direct bus to the city. Another way you could do it, of course, would be to take out those purple routes, spend that resource instead on building a frequent orbital. And you can see the pros and cons. The pros are that everyone now is on a frequent line that connects with other frequent lines that enables you to go lots of places. So look, hypothetically, if this were, say, in the south, we might have, you might be on a branching line coming out of Rathmines and covering a little area. Nice, you have an infrequent bus to the city. But instead, you could be on a bus route that goes all the way west to, crossing all these lines to Ballyfermot, all the way east to Sandymount, to the beach. And it would be frequent enough that anywhere it crossed any other radial line, that would be an easy connection. So if you want to go from this area to UCD Belfield, very easy. You just ride a frequent line across to Stillorgan Road, connect to a frequent line to go south. Whereas the existing network is encouraging you to go into the city and back out to make that kind of trip. And so one of the issues of the existing network is not just that it's taking people out of direction, but that it is adding to a CPD capacity problem by taking people into the center who don't actually want to go there. So this is another idea for how it might work. You can see who is not going to like it. There are people here who like their direct bus to the city. They've had it for 38 years. They've been riding it for 19 years. They're very used to it. They're going to be very mad when you change it. But you can decide whether getting to something like that is worth that process and having those conversations. So this will be the question. It's the question that the web survey is about. Are the benefits worth the inconvenience? Now, this is the sort of moment where I don't want to be perceived as making a recommendation. What we've done is illustrate another way it could work. But what we're doing is asking rather than recommending. We're saying, here are the trade-offs. There are pros and cons. And my particular style as a consultant is not to then say, so I think you should do this. What I'll say is the geometry, the geometric facts of what public transport is and what your city is lead us up to this choice. Lead us up to needing to choose between retaining a very interchange-oriented but less frequent network or having a more interchange-dependent, simpler, higher frequency network. And my job is to elucidate the trade-offs rather than to make the decision for you as a community. So that's why we've been very careful to say there is no proposal, there is no recommendation. At this stage, there is simply the question. And if you look at the web survey, you'll notice us asking you simply, which of these things is more important to you, or what would be your priority if you were making this decision in NTA's place, rather than ever saying, here's a proposal, what do you think? In having this conversation, we want you to assume a few things. First of all, as I mentioned, it's happening on a separate track, but I'll ask you to assume that we will achieve a fare structure in which there is no fare penalty for interchange. In other words, the cost of your trip will not depend on whether you have to change buses. That will probably be achieved only on the Leap card, but it is achievable. We will assume that adequate vehicle capacity is provided, so you shouldn't worry about, will I be able to get on the second bus? You should assume that enough service is provided to address the capacity needs. You should assume that there's good shelter and real-time information at interchange stops. In many cases, there already is. That there'll be attention to safe and pleasant walks at the interchange stops, and that there will be continued improvements in reliability, which is what another parallel track of Bus Connects is about. So finally, I want to show you a little bit about how we might visualize the benefits of such a proposal. And this is a little bit of a preview. What will happen once we get everyone's feedback on the high-level choices is that we'll get together with NTA staff and we'll figure out, okay, what strategy or mix of strategies should our final recommended plan represent? For example, we've shown you some fairly ambitious ways we could change the network to make it more frequent. If what we hear back from the public is, yes, go that way, we're interested, then we'll do more of that in the draft recommended network. If people are mostly negative about it, we'll do less of it. So that's the purpose of this cycle, of this position in the cycle, this particular consultation we're doing now. But I want to show you then, when we have a recommended network, how we might talk about it and how we might show the benefits. So these images, again, are from our recent study in Silicon Valley. And again, this is Jane. She's a hypothetical person who's been plopped down at a particular point. You can actually move her around and see how the access changes from different points. And this is from one extreme of a spectrum of possibilities that we presented. This was the lower frequency alternative, but the one that kept more direct services for people. So the one that's more like the existing system. And then moving in the other direction, the spectrum was moving toward much more frequent main lines but with fewer square back into nooks and crannies, relying more on frequency and interchange and less on direct services. So as you went from something more like the existing system to something more ambitious like that, I could show you that this blob went from this to this to this. So the most painful trade-offs associated with the most ambitious option, which is something like what I've shown you, pushing all the way to the most ambitious effort to make the network frequent and thereby rely on more interchange, has given Jane more opportunities in her life. It's given her more freedom. She, in the amount of time she has, she can go more places, have therefore more choices, right? She has a greater choice of where she works, a greater choice of where she can study, a greater choice of where she can shop, a greater choice of organization she can belong to, and if she is dating at the moment, she has a greater choice of people that she could date, which may affect who she marries. All of that is in here, isn't it? Is in here. Face it, there's only so much of this you can do online, right? There's just only so much of this you can do online. And once you're offline, this is what matters. So we can show then, okay, for someone in this position, someone located in this position, I can say, okay, if someone lives where I put Jane down, they have that many jobs within a 30-minute trip, and I can show them how that goes up, doubling that number of jobs that can be reached in that most ambitious scenario. So this is very direct. This is very visceral. This is also just geometry, right? It's totally mathematical calculation. No human behavior, no social science in this. It's just, how have I expanded her liberty? This is actually a good opportunity to come back and make sure we all notice the philosophical problem, which is that freedom and predictability are kind of opposites, right? When I tell you that a computer model knows how you will behave in 2030, I've told you that you don't have much freedom, haven't I? I've told you that you're not going to surprise us. And so one of the reasons I want to talk just about freedom is that I'm talking about, no, I actually want you all to be able to surprise us. I care about what you can do, and what you can do has a value that isn't summed up by an estimate of what you will do. The fact that you had options is itself important. And I think we all know that about our lives. And we actually know that about what creates economic value too. It's something more than just the prediction about who will actually use it. This is a very important thing to come back to, because a lot of the media, the press conversation about public transport tends to go very quickly to, oh, did it meet its patronage targets? What's the patronage? So let me let you in on a secret, which is that patronage is just ridiculously volatile. It goes up and down for crazy reasons. It also goes up and down for lots of external reasons that have nothing to do with anything the Public Transport Authority is doing. And so it is a poor thing to look at. Recently, for example, I did a huge network redesign. We erased every route and put it down differently in Houston. That went into effect 2 years ago. And the month after it went into effect, patronage was down. And I was seeing all this media and getting all these phone calls from reporters. How do you feel? I mean, was it all wrong? I mean, do you think you got it wrong? And then the next month it went way up, and I got phone calls from reporters. Man, you must feel great. How does it feel? You know. And then the next month it went down, and I got calls from reporters. I don't know. And the answer, of course, is calm down. There isn't an answer that's going to work on your deadline, but the reality is it's going to take a while for us to know. And where we are now actually is that ridership is level in the context of all other Texas transit systems having plummeted. Has to do with Texas's dependence on the oil economy and that having, of course, gone down with the price of oil. But the point is, this is about something more than patronage, and the patronage benefits are things you build in the long term. Think about the effect, for example, of having a good frequent network designed and marketed, and the way over several years people start to relocate in response to it, so that over time the frequent network comes to be lined with people who appreciate it. And how can that not be good for patronage, right? But it's ultimately, you have to be able to have that sort of geometric conversation to help people understand why, of course, this is a good patronage investment, even though the bottom line of patronage, if that's all you're looking at, is going to be volatile and crazy, and you're going to have a lot of patience to see the long run. To sum up, it's very important to remember there are no proposals out right now. There's an illustration of some options, but the options are open. We do want we're exploring what could be possible if we ask people to tolerate more interchange, and we want everyone's opinion, including all of yours and those of people you talk to, about whether these ideas should be the basis of the recommended plan. busconnects.ie is the place to go and read more about it. There's a link to a blog post of mine about this, and also a survey you can take, and you can also download our, I think, very readable, image-heavy choices report itself, which will take you through some of this information in even more detail. Next steps. The report on this material was released today. We did the launch this morning. The month of June is basically the period for the public consultation on this report, so please act quickly. Please do whatever you're going to do in response to this, the web survey, talking to your friends, whatever it is, please do that as ASAP. The draft network, based on what we hear in the consultation, we'll get with NTA. We'll figure out what the principles should be for the draft network. We'll develop that. We'll do all this detail about benefits and impacts like I illustrated. That will come out in the autumn sometime. We'll of course have a public consultation on that. But one of my goals, one of the reasons we're having this first phase, we're doing this launch now, we're talking just about the strategies, is that I want key opinion leaders, when they see the draft complete network, to not be surprised. I want them to remember that yes, we had this conversation, and that's why the overall design of the network looks as it does. Remember? So that we have that core of familiarity with it, so that it's less surprising. That turns out to be a key tool in helping manage all of the inevitable public response to all the details of a recommended plan, many of which are going to be quite negative, because people tend to respond very negatively to change, even in situations where, the status quo is obviously not entirely working. One way or another, we get to some kind of final network for implementation in late 18 or early 19. So thanks very much for your time, and I'm happy to entertain any questions at this point. And Barry, you're roving with the mic? Excellent. Questions?
You haven't said much about looking at multimodal transport. So you seem to be looking at the bus network as an independent system, but shouldn't it connect with our other rail systems and transit systems? And how will you consider that?
Yeah, we're building around Lewis and Dart. So the bus network is obviously designed to build upon what Lewis and Dart are doing, and you'll see a lot of emphasis on, again, using Lewis and Dart as parts of the high frequency network that are already there, looking at bringing lots of more bus connections to them, using Lewis and Dart stations where appropriate as hubs for local networks. All that is very much part of it. The only reason I didn't mention it is we take them as given rather than thinking we can redesign them. But they're definitely the foundation on which we're building everything. Yes? So, yeah, the second, I mean, best practice now is, and you see this all the time now in Northern Europe, that key points in the network are multimodal hubs. They're in logical places. There is secure bike parking, in addition to, you know, the appropriate kinds of interchange facilities for where the public transport network is connecting with itself. I don't think you'll see all of that on opening day, but I think that that's an infrastructural direction that NTA is interested in. I also agree with you that the quality of the interchange experience is very important. What we will be dealing with on opening day of a network like this by 2019 is probably, you know, not everything you would ideally want, but is something to start with that is safe and functional and decent. Probably made of, you know, shelters like the ones you see, but you know, with appropriate considerations for capacity and so on. So in terms of this question of are people, yeah, people aren't logical. People aren't logical, you're right. But people do, over the long run, respond to freedom. And many of the reasons that people don't use public transport, and particularly don't use buses, are things that we think of as behavioral, but which I could just as well describe as logical. For example, the CBD bus network is so complicated that you can say it's a matter of human behavior that I'm overwhelmed by this map and just walk away from it. Or you can say the amount of effort I would have to spend to learn how to make the trip I'm making makes it illogical to do that. See what I mean? I can go either way with how I describe that. And so generally my sort of approach, because my sort of approach is, if I can find a way to make this sound logical, I'll do that, because it's fundamentally an easier way to sort of get everyone together on, oh yeah, I understand, I would do that. But nobody denies that human behavior is a large part of it, that it isn't logical. That's why the path from a network to a freedom outcome is much simpler. It's a mathematical thing, as opposed to getting from there to patronage, which is very complicated, yeah, and very empirical.
Hi, I was just wondering, have you done studies about the effect of introducing a number of different interchanges, and does that affect the demographics? So are you kind of ruling out younger people and older people, and you know, the effect that has on social inclusion and things like that?
It's amazing how readily people adapt to their public transport network and how little impact this actually has. Ultimately, people do make their lives work with public transport. Some people drop off of it because it isn't convenient for them anymore, but many poor people find it's convenient. That's one of the reasons, by the way, why the payoffs are gradual, because, you know, people who are angry disappear at once, and people who are benefiting take time to discover what you can do. It doesn't really make a demographic difference. There will sometimes be effects that are different in different places, and you'll lose a little bit out of, you know, like if we were to rearrange that service as I showed, so that one neighborhood was only on an orbital, we'd probably lose some certain kinds of trips out of that, but gain others. But it doesn't make an enormous categorical demographic difference in terms of like people of different ages reacting differently, because people are reacting based on where they are. It's geographical, and you know, geography isn't demography here to that much of a degree. It's not like you have one whole low-income side of town or one whole immigrant side of town. It's all very well mixed here, which is wonderful, but which means that a demographic, an impact on a particular age group or category is not likely to be that pronounced. It's really just different people in different geographic situations will respond differently. Did you have one there? Well, while you're there.
Yep. Two short questions, but I think they have an effect on the ultimate network that is designed. What distance is used with respect to the walking bus stops? Because obviously it really depends on the frequency there, because as we know, we're willing to go further to a higher frequency service. So
Right.
I'm just curious how that's built into the design equation, as it were. And
That's interesting.
The network design. And maybe while I'm here, the third interesting point is where do you place the orbital routes? Clearly, the further out you go, the people who are left in the middle are going to have issues. They'll want it closer to where they are, unless they're close enough to a radial route already.
So I'll take these in reverse order, and I'll take these in reverse order, and by the time we get to the first one, you'll probably have to remind me what it was. Yes, obviously there would be a series of concentric orbitals at various distances. And obviously we'd be looking at those sorts of issues you described. And again, it's a matter of coming up with the right mix of trade-offs, whether it's a local route that covers that area, whether it's an orbital that's frequent enough that it's not that big a deal to interchange or whatever. Your second question was, summarize it for me again briefly.
To do with the value of time.
Value of time. Okay, so
Being happier with the zero interchange.
This
even
is
if
great.
It's nearly twice as long.
this is great. So you can do a lot of empirical research on that, which is great, and come up with value of time figures. You can also observe that different people are going to experience that differently based on exactly what they're doing on the bus, right? If I have my laptop out, that's a big hassle. If I'm reading, it's a small hassle. If I'm listening to my podcast and I'm just, on my headphones, I can just dance out the bus and onto the other bus, and I don't interrupt anything, right? So it really does depend on what you're doing. And there is clearly a value of time element to that. And I don't want to say that it's nothing. I would question our ability to say that it's 7.3 or something either, right? But there is something there, and that's certainly part of what you need to weigh. And your first question?
The walking distance.
Right, walking
that
distance.
you're using
So by
in
and
the
large,
analysis for Dublin.
yeah, by and large in this study, we are largely working with existing walking distances because we're not envisioning either deleting a lot of existing segments or adding a lot of existing segments. So the question doesn't arise in the way it would in a lot of other studies where we were actually talking about, taking out routes or putting routes in. It is generally true that people will walk further to more frequent service. There is, of course, a major difference between the distances people are willing to walk and the distances they will complain about walking. And so we have to take that in. But in practice, it's very easy for people to walk 500 meters to service, overwhelm. Lots and lots of people do that. And when we're talking about an extremely attractive service, you'll get a longer walking distance. There, some people walk up to a K to a really, really good service. Tends to be a faster rail service or something like that. But it comes down to is it worth it to get to whatever service that is? Sir,
Yeah, sorry. Shane McSweeney, Ernst & Young. Great presentation, so thank you. In terms of, and it's a semi-related question, in terms of demand, how are you actually mapping a customer's journey? So Leapcard will obviously give you a lot of data, but in terms of when I leave my house, how far I walk to a bus stop, where I get off the bus and where I ultimately will end up,
right,
will obviously influence the spine graph that you had there. So can you just talk me through how you're actually looking at that from...
We are, with all apologies to the big data people who think we need that sort of detailed information about like the trip you're making. The bigger a thing you're deploying, and public transport is, fixed public transport is a big thing. There's a crudeness to it, which is inseparable to our ability to build it up to the kind of mass where it does what it does. We're not all that interested in the exact origin destination patterns of people. Mostly, we're somewhat interested, and we're looking at it, and it's in the model, and we'll deal with it. But fundamentally, if you show me a big mass of high-density residential and a big mass of activity and employment, I know I've got a big market. And at the scale at which we're working, that's most of what we need to know. So, one of the things that will one of the things that will often come up, with my friends in the big data world is that they're constantly writing articles saying, those poor public transport planners, they've been in the dark until we had all of this rich data. The kind of rich data that tells you that at 7:30 p.m. 2 people here will go over there every Thursday except when it's raining. All that sort of rich detail about what people are actually doing. And the reality is, to design big mass networks, I can't do anything with that detail, right? Big data is big detail. And big detail is useful at a certain low altitude. But at this stage, to get a network right, we have to be thinking first at a high altitude where that sort of stuff doesn't matter. What matters is the big flows, and we can read those big flows not just off of current travel demand patterns, which we look at, but also just off of the development pattern. Again, you know, there's Grand Canal, there's Capitol Dock. I can look at that and see, okay, that's a colossal public transport market, and I don't need to know anything about the people there. I can look at the fact that I've got enormous density, I've got narrow streets, it's not gonna be a place where most people can come and go by car, it's gonna have colossal demand. And I can start to look at, you know, there are all these different places that demand's likely to come from, see? So I don't need to know that much detail. And that's why at this high altitude in particular, we tend to look very closely at development patterns. If you look at the choices report, you'll see detailed maps of density, detailed maps of car ownership, detailed maps of those kinds of things. We know those patterns and maps of existing patronage. But I can also show you, if you look closely and you compare the maps, you'll see how much patronage is predicted by density, right? You'll see how much they line up. Well, the more they line up, the more I can just use density to read patronage potential, see, without knowing that much more detail. So that's the key. We need different degrees of data at different altitudes. And we're working right now at this stage in the process at a high altitude. What will be the big structure of the whole system? As we work down into lower altitudes, as we proceed toward a detailed plan, that detail will become more and more useful. But still, always, when we're designing such a big mass thing as a bus network, I don't need to know as much as you might think about the exact details of what everyone is doing, because it's not going to affect what we do. It's the big difference between public transport and, you know, what some of the cool kids are doing out there in terms of, you know, demand responsive small vehicle stuff. Public transport is mass, and as a result, it responds to big patterns.
Yeah.
Who's next? You next?
Okay.
Total interchange between all the three routes in 5 minutes, which answers one of the points about safety and comfort in interchange. And lastly, I don't know whether you're walking around Dublin, just taking you to O'Connell Bridge, where you'll find the bus stop out in the middle of the bridge, no shelter, howling winds and rain in winter. I think it must be one of the more bizarre bus stops anywhere in the world. So I welcome the concepts of portrayed tonight, and certainly look forward to reading the report and hopefully seeing some implementations.
Thanks very much. And if you think I don't understand your weather, please check the weather, the climate in Portland, Oregon. It's windy and raining half the year. We're very clear on what that's like. It's dark a lot too.
If you look at Dublin and compare it to mainland Europe cities, it's very low indeed. And you have the sea on one side with nobody living there at all. Does that act as a constraint on what you might do if you had a city which wasn't on the sea and was high?
Well, density is always going to drive the intensity of public transport demand. If you were a much denser city than you are, you would probably have a metro network by now, because the city would have stopped functioning if you hadn't. When I look at Dublin, I see a largely two-story city well out into the suburbs. I mean, I go well out into the suburbs and I still see people living in attached houses, or, you know, two-story attached houses, or, you know, two-story patterns. And then we come into the center of the city, of course, and we see 3, 4, 5 stories pretty routinely. So yes, it's less dense than, you know, something like Paris. But if you imagined, but given that you don't have a metro here, you know, and that buses have to do it, it does mean a really intense bus system, because it's plenty dense for that. And I think you do have certain corridors where, you know, a metro is going to make sense eventually, but we always start with buses. So I've worked in lots of I am very familiar with most of the European cities. One of my major projects recently was in Moscow, which is more or less the shape Dublin would be if it didn't have the harbor. It's also a spider web, you know, radials and circles kind of shape. And again, it's so much denser, but then there is the metro handling most of that density. And if you sort of net that out, you end up with something on a Dublin scale, see what I mean? You know, which is more or less the problem that the buses have to address.
I just want to say, again, like the other speakers, I'm very impressed with the concepts that you're coming up with. An interesting point you made there, at the moment you're at looking at a very high level, and subsequently we'll go to the
Right.
detail. That's a problem I think we've suffered in Dublin over the years, in that we had Network Direct back in 2009, 10, 11, when the network was, that was the first major recast of the network we had for donkey's years. But whilst some of the broad proposals were very good, the actual implementation in terms of level of detail was appalling. For example, 66 and 66A and 66B outbound have perfect 15-minute headway. Inbound, all day, they meet in Leeds, two buses come in together, and then a half-hour gap. And that's been like that for 6 years. You know, and other implementation, over the years, we had dark feeder bus routes. You mentioned those. We have a history of dark feeder buses leaving just as darks pull in.
All those things. Yeah.
You know, we have an appalling history in Dublin of not implementing the proposals and following through on the detail. And it's something I certainly say to you, you need to drive that home when you come along, because we, you know, even when I was looking at your proposal, you were talking about, say, the 18, you know, putting high frequency on that bus route. That bus route has got to be one of the most traffic congested bus routes, particularly going eastwards in the mornings. It can take up to 20 minutes to get through each.
Right.
So you're going to be faced with, you know, infrastructural problems like that, but also then, you know, we had an example in Sallynoggin, for example, there was recent review of the network out there, and the 7 and 7A were recast, and they both take diverging routes inbound, which causes the headway to be completely
Right.
distorted, where it should be a nice 15-minute frequency. You've got
So
two buses.
let me pull this together and make a key point. If I haven't articulated this yet, implicit in all of this is an airplane metaphor for planning. And the way that metaphor works is to do a plan properly over an entire area, you first must get up to the altitude where you can see the entire area. And that's going to be an altitude which gives you the large area but not so much detail. And we get up there and we consciously ignore a lot of detail. As I'm working at that level, I will be, you know, people will be coming out with me with detail, and I'll be saying, yes, remember that, we'll get back to that, okay? Because if we're overwhelmed with detail, we can't see the big picture, right? And then a good process of planning is controlled descent, right? Where you, okay, we've seen what we need to do with the big picture of the whole region, so now let's look at Dunleary and work in some more detail in Dunleary. And then, okay, we can go down to the level of we're working out exact bus stops, and then we're working on shelters, and then it happens. We implement it, and that is the plane touching the ground, right? And now having brought the benefits of its trip back to Earth where it affects people. And then, of course, that metaphor also clarifies that the danger is always of sudden catastrophic loss of altitude, which is what happens when you let the detail into the thought process too early, before you have the high altitude solutions worked out. So part of what we bring to these processes is really, really rigid discipline about that, that makes sure we have been able to see a high altitude thing and have a high altitude conversation, which is also, by the way, what's unusual and special about this outreach what we're doing, where we are very intentionally asking the public high altitude questions. At this stage of the outreach, I don't want to know what you think about your bus stop. I want to know what kind of public transport network you want and what kinds of trade-offs in general you'd be willing to make. Yeah, good.
Hi, how you doing? I'm just wondering, this is not a high altitude question, so it's actually probably we're nearly on the ground question, but what's your opinion of local services which might not fill the requirements of an orbital route? They're partially orbital. So for example, if you go to your slide on the 151 and the 13, was it the 13? Within that breakup, those two services, within this, you will have things like, say, Clondalkin, there is a shopping centre, access to, say, things like Liffey Valley and other such things, which might not fill a full orbital route, but still provide feeder services towards your high-frequency trunk lines.
So there are two ways to do things out here. One of them, you do build orbitals like this one, where you have an orbital path. Where you don't have an orbital path, you often break things off into feeders and circulators. That's the case, for example, I mean, I happened to put these two together, but it's spectacularly the problem between Blanchardstown and Lucan, right? There is no way to get across that gap other than the M50. So, you know, there would certainly need to be some sort of orbital there, but a lot of this area would, if you were doing the most efficient kind of network, would probably get oriented toward feeders into a frequent main line. So yeah, it's not necessarily orbitals, it's also circulators and local feeder services.
Could I ask just one more question? What's your opinion then of, I think the man down here referenced it, was a pulse schedule, especially for DART connections or for like ferry services, etc.
So what this gentleman was describing was a pulse. And a pulse is a way of organizing low frequency service every 30 minutes or more, so that you can make fast connections among them even though the frequency is light. And that means that a bunch of the buses from different routes are scheduled to arrive at a place at a particular time, sit together for a little while, and so that people can connect among them and then they all leave. It's beautiful when it works. It tends to work in small towns with fairly consistent low levels of traffic congestion. And as we try to apply it in suburban areas, in big cities, we tend to find that we have the problem that it magnifies small problems of reliability, right? A bus is 5 minutes late, it misses the connection, so now everyone is stranded for an hour or half an hour. So we're very familiar with pulsing. Actually, I've introduced it in a lot of cities. It's very common in North America, but it does carry those risks, and so we're mindful of those risks as we think about where to introduce it.
Based on experience in other cities, how you deal with what I'll term the Mrs. Murphy problem. Mrs. Murphy currently travels 2 stops to get on a Friday
Right.
to get a pension, and with the redesign as proposed, she will now have to make a change.
Right.
So she asked the local TD. A local meeting is organised. A whole lot of people turn up. Most of them have never been in a bus in the last 20 years. Who all express outrage at the redesign, and it's watered down. And end up with this, which I think keeps happening here. And end up with this, what you term the coverage problem, where the network that emerges doesn't really suit anyone. It's this inelegant compromise. So Mrs. Murphy gets her 68A that runs an hour-long headway that carries virtually nobody, but it's a political thing that's put in to keep.
So this is a problem of educating elected officials about what it means to design mass transit, as opposed to taxi services operated within practically large vehicles, which is what Mrs. Murphy wants. And this is and I don't want to ridicule it, this is fundamentally the hardest thing about network design, is that if you have a bus with 3 people on it, those 3 people may really need it, feel very entitled to it, and can make a lot of noise. And, you know, so I'll tell you, when I talk to elected officials about this, and I've been doing that all last week, I've been doing workshops with counselors, I have been saying, right, please understand that if you want us to go in this direction, you will sit through meetings in which beautiful people will come before you and scream at you and tell you you're destroying their lives, and you will have to sit through that. That is part of this process. And if you know you can't sit through that, you might as well object at this stage, right? Because this is the stage we're at now is the time to stop it. I mean, I'll expand a little bit on how that worked in Houston. When we did the Houston plan, I worked with that council that actually runs the services directly. And I said, look, so they wanted to make this kind of change. They wanted to move toward a higher patronage network, and I showed them the geometry of why this would be a higher patronage way to go. But I also said, look, you get to decide how far to go this way, and as you turn the dial toward this outcome that you want, you're going to get more patronage, and you're going to get more screaming, and it's going to be horrible for you. I didn't mince words. It's going to be horrible. I said, you're going to sit through these hearings where all of these beautiful people will tell you about how horrible this is for them and how they will lose their jobs and so on. Some of them will be right. Many of them will be over-dramatizing, but a few of them will be right. You'll have trouble telling that apart. It will wear on you listening to this. I also told them at some point in this process, a newspaper is going to do a front page story of a human interest story about someone who currently rides the bus, who is losing the bus service that they're used to, and they're going to make that a giant human interest story. There'll be photographs, there'll be biography and all that, and testimonials. And that happened too. The front page of the Houston Chronicle had on one day a full front page photo essay about a middle-aged man with a lunchbox sitting at a bus stop where he has sat for the last 25 years. And now the bus stop's going away. And they devote the front page to photographing him from different angles in slightly different moods. And they have a little testimonial from him, you know, a little quotation from him that gives you a sense of sort of how he thinks and why he's special. And, you know, nowhere on this page does it say that there is a bus stop 2 blocks away with more frequent service that will get him there faster. So that's what the media will do. That's what you'll see in the press. So I took them through all that, and I said, look, all this is going to happen. This is going to be horrible for you, and all I can say is that that's temporary and the benefits are lasting. But I couldn't say, you know, this is going to be. Now, you know, we may have somewhat different traditions in the respective countries, and I don't want to scare these people too much, but I am always emphatic, and we should all be emphatic in talking about this. We are not saying this will be easy. We are not saying that the public outcry in response to changing anything is going to be a pleasant, you know, warm, fuzzy process. It's not going to be. It's going to be very challenging. And what happened in Houston is an interesting thing was that when we got finally to the final plan, we had a draft plan before them. And the public outcry was exactly as you would expect, exactly as I had prepared them for. We did get that front page piece. And the 2 members of the council who wanted to throw out the plan at that point were the 2 who had not been with me at the beginning when we had taken them through that process and helped them understand what they were getting into. So what I have largely heard, you know, I haven't spoken to TDs last week, but I've spoken to a lot of counselors. And what I've generally heard from many of them is, yeah, we get it. We get it, we understand, this is part of it. But again, that's part of making this choice, and that's part of why this choice is harder than just, you know, let's believe that consultant's recommendation and then blame him if we don't like it, you know, which is how it usually happens.
I was going.
My name is Jarrett Walker, and I used to work for Dublin Consultation for years.
Right.
I have actually changed bus network, so I know how that can be competing. You are actually playing with their lives so importantly through the analysis process.
Right.
Yesterday you got a call, and having heard your presentation about management, that's a great call. I was going to ask about political risk and financial risk. Political risk has more or less been asked there now. One small word of advice I would give you, if you're talking to a room full of 40 or 50 councillors, is to be consistent and say no to everybody, and then there's no issue. Because one of these arbitrary things. But it's a small city, it's a small country, and the political risk is an issue.
So, quickly, I tend to remember only the last question someone asked, so I'll go backwards through them. Interchange is implementation, big bang versus sectors. Some of our plans are implemented by sector, but those are usually in cities that are modular and that come apart easily. Auckland, New Zealand is basically an archipelago, very nearly, and so we can do sort of this blob of it very separate from those other blobs. Houston was a giant grid, and part of a giant grid is that everything is completely interdependent. You can't do a piece of that. You have to do the whole thing at once. So I am tending to encourage big bangs more and more, because in situations where designing the situation in which we have only part of it ends up being so much work, ends up raising so many of its own issues that, you know, it's worth getting past it. And the way to get past it is to do it all at once. Creates a big event. I mean, it creates a big media event. Everyone knows. It's much easier to get everybody in the city aware that everything's happening on one Saturday night. And so that tends to be increasingly the way we're going. The big bang, but with a lot of lead time. You know, with plenty of time ahead. You know, 6 months from when you absolutely pin down every detail of the network to when you implement it. 6 months in which the NTA and Dublin Bus can really focus on everything that needs to change. Financial, yes, there is financial risk. What I will say is NTA knows about this and is thinking about it, and that's probably all I can say about that. They're clear on the fact that there's a financial risk there. They're thinking about what that means, but I'm not hearing from them, and you would have to ask them. You'd have to ask Tim Gaston. But I'm not hearing from them that they think this is impossible. What I'm hearing from them is they understand the need to get rid of the interchange penalty, and that's a priority for them, and they're thinking about the financial impact.
One more question.
Jarrett, great presentation. I just have a question. How many interchanges do you envisage on a network of this size?
Excellent question. How many times will someone have to interchange? The overwhelming majority of people will still have a direct bus to Dublin City, which means one interchange will get them to almost anywhere. Maybe up to 15–20% of people will not have a direct bus to Dublin City, so certain trips might require 2 interchanges. If you're going, for example, from a feeder outside of Blanchardstown to a feeder outside of Dunleary, but not very many people are making those trips. So by and large, I think the answer is a large number of trips will require 1 interchange. A few will require 2. Of course, there'll still be many that require 0.
Okay, but how many actual nodes of interchange do you envision? Planned out as
Well, in a grid pattern, if you have a grid pattern with lots of frequent radials and frequent orbitals, then you have lots and lots of interchange points. So anywhere those cross is an interchange. In addition, in the suburbs, you tend to have more single concentrated points like Blanchardstown Town Center.
I suppose what I'm getting at is I would see that there's a potential to use interchanges to development opportunity for land uses, and that if this is strategically planned, that we use some sort of income to fund the network if
Right.
and also through development contribution.
So that's you're talking about something called value capture, which is in some way capturing some of the profit, you know, whether from a big development to help pay for the infrastructure it requires. There are many ways that can go. It can go via the development fee route. It can go via some sort of tax or whatever. There are lots of different ways it works. It's very important for the development of high-capacity transit services, which have major capital costs up front. It is harder to do for what this is, which is really just bus operations, where the cost is overwhelmingly operations rather than capital. Operations is forever, and it's very hard to get a developer to pay for forever. You can extract, they're going to get a big bang of profit, you can extract pieces of that, but because it's a big bang, it tends to be more suited to capital, it tends to be more suited to building something, which is how it's usually used. But yes, value capture is an important thing to know about. A lot of cities have done a lot with it in terms of building infrastructure. less so for the kind of operations planning we're talking about here. By the way, we are working in a context of not much growth in the overall quantity of service. You have a lot of service out there. You have almost 1,000 buses on the street in peak hour. So it's more a matter of seeing how we can reallocate it in ways to make it more effective. So thanks very much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jarrett. And can we give him a round of applause?
So please remember, there are things to do about this. Busconnects.ie. Thank you.